My name is Robert Murray. I was born in Vancouver. I grew up in Saskatoon. I lived for a while in Mexico, and I moved to New York City in 1960. A few years ago, I sold my loft in New York and built a studio next to our house here in Pennsylvania. I also spend the summers on an island up in the Georgian Bay, the eastern part of Lake Huron. And it was as a result of getting this place that I got interested in the idea of obtaining a float plane. Because I was still a Canadian citizen, in those days you couldn't own an American registered aircraft. So I bought a plane built in Canada that was a Fleet 80 Canuck that came with floats, wheels, and skis. I think it was George Larson from Flying Magazine who told me about Dave Quam and his interest in launching a seaplane association, and George, I believe, drove me out to Little Ferry, where I had earlier gotten my seaplane rating. And I met Dave, and after talking to him and hearing about his ambitions for a new seaplane association, I offered to come on board and give him a hand getting a newsletter started. That eventually led to a much more involved state of affairs with a number of other publications that we did. It was possible largely because of one of our early board members, Al Lish, who lived only a few blocks from Little Ferry. And Al was a printer by trade, and because of him we not only got favorable rates on our printing, but he was able to accommodate the work in his shop and did a great job in getting us half-tones and the occasional color separation at very reasonable rates. At any rate, I'll show you a few of these early publications and what it led to. I'm sure most of you are familiar with what's coming out of Florida now, but you may not be aware of what the first few publications looked like when we got the association started back in the early 70s. At any rate, this is a book of some of our first publications that Dave Quam put together for me. This was what our first newsletters looked like. And they were, as you can see, basically news items, short pieces. I always loved this cartoon, which came from a very, very early flying magazine. Two guys getting seaplane instruction. The guy says, pull back the stick and give it the gun. Well, it seemed funny at the time. So this was typical of what our early newsletters looked like that I laid out and helped organize and Al published. One of the things that Dave wanted to do right from the beginning was to get a seaplane base directory going. We went to the FAA, tried to get them to publish something. They weren't interested. The Canadians turned out a very good seaplane directory. So we decided on a very modest basis to do our own. That eventually led to independent publications that were designed so you could carry them in the aircraft with you. This was a data sheet that we circulated among our members and mailed to all the seaplane bases to try and get relevant information and photos or diagrams of the bases. At any rate, this is how it began, and but one of the problems that we had was that we began to accumulate a number of fairly longish articles and decided that we'd launch our own magazine. We called it an annual, but the first few of them were more than a few years apart. This was the first one, I think, printed in 1976. The first newsletter, I think, came out in 1973. So these were a little bit more of a more ambitious undertaking. Here's volume 1, number 1. This is number 2. And what I remember about this in particular is that, well, I guess what I remember in particular is that everywhere I went, including to see the Martin Mars in Vancouver Island, I took a camera with me. I got in the habit of clicking photos everywhere I went because that was one of the hardest things to get for the magazine. Jay Fry at Edo was terrifically helpful. We'd go out and pirate his files all the time, and we would get people to send in historical photos of aircraft, in some cases collections of their own, such as the Ray Crone here. Getting timely photographs of fly-ins and other events was tough, so to be sure we had things on file, I began documenting everything everywhere I went. I suppose what was memorable about this issue in particular is that we got an Aviation and Space Writers Award for it, which was somewhat unusual for such a fledgling publication, but that was a real boost to us and made us feel like we'd joined the big boys. I mentioned the seaplane directories. This was the first one that was that I put together from data that Mary Silich had collected. The AOPA then helped me flesh it out, and we tried to come up with a format that you could hold in one hand in your airplane. Pages would stay opened wherever, and it was something that you could carry along with you. Again, it was a mix of seaplane-based information and state-by-state regulations, both where you could land, but equally important, where you weren't supposed to land. It has come out on a pretty regular basis. This is one of the more recent ones, and as you can see, it's getting to be a pretty sizable publication and one well worth having. Other magazines were very supportive of the Seaplane Association, particularly in the early years. Flying Magazine gave us some real boosts, and they would turn out usually a spring issue that covered float flying activity or water flying activity, and this is one that I contributed to. Jack Leggett, who was the editor of Sport Flying, gave us space in his magazine before we started our own annual, and so we could get articles into this magazine every month, both news from the association. As a matter of fact, he gave several organizations space in the magazine. And this is also an article I wrote about my first airplane for sport flying. One of the things I tried to do, particularly when I was less involved on a day-to-day basis with the association, what does it politicians say? I had to spend quality time with my family. At any rate, I worked out a format, logo type, and a layout for them that the various directors could follow if they chose to. And by this time, our publications were being done for us by Scientific Press up in Ephrata, Pennsylvania. So again, we kept up the updating for the directory. You could take out these pieces and put them into the existing directories, or they would go into the data for the next one that was published. I think I mentioned earlier that one of the nice things about the magazine was that it went well beyond the membership, and we had sales outlets in places as far away as Sudbury, Ontario, and the Air and Space Museum in Washington. He used to sell our magazine in their bookstore. This gave us a chance to promote the association, promote the activity of water flying, and help to put it on the map. And here's a couple of more recent water flying magazines, which now replaces the annual and the newsletter, and comes out on a more regular basis. This was after the association moved to Florida. I suppose it's interesting to remember that when I first began doing this magazine, it was back in the days of cut and paste galleys, get separations, and halftones for the illustrations. Dave Quam used to drive them in from Al Lish to my loft in New York, and I'd set up long tables inside my loft and get one of my art students to help me cut and paste the magazines together, and we put them like a and like a freight train, they went together one page at a time, and then eventually onto the printer. And after Al passed on, we began using a printer in Ephrata, Pennsylvania. And about the time I pulled back from the association to concentrate on my own work is when desktop publishing came in, and so now the whole damn thing can be done on a computer. There's not all that laborious makeup time that goes into the magazine, and we're now able to use full color, whereas we were limited to 1 or 2 full color pages that had to be carefully placed within the signatures of the magazine. So the magazine's changed a lot, but largely because of the new printing techniques and the use of the computer. And one of the other things that happened, in part because my immediate neighbor on Lookout Island was Paul Arthur, who was an internationally known graphic designer. And Paul had worked out a system of what he called Picta Graphics, a signage system that's used a lot on highways, airports, railroad stations, and so on. And Paul and I worked together to develop a pictogram for a seaplane. In part it was used on to mark seaplane bases on highways, but we adopted it as our logo, and then it was eventually registered in royal blue on white.
The publications were the U.S. Seaplane Pilots Association, and in 1978 the U.S. was dropped and it was simply called the Seaplane Pilots Association. Here are a few of the covers of the early days, starting with number 1. These are the publications that Robert Murray put together for us and added a touch of class for the organization. Throughout the years we changed the format a little bit, and at some point when we went to AOPA, then AOPA designed and published our Seaplane Newsletter and WaterFlying Annual. Thanks to Robert Murray and Al Lish, we started off with a great publication for the members, and it told the world that we're here to stay. It took 30 years to get where we are today, and that's because of your membership. My thanks to Al Lish and Robert Murray for adding some class and a good publication to the Seaplane Pilots Association. Thank you, Bob. Bob Summers in a place called Lookout Island, which is just west of Point Barrow, and that's north of Parry Sound, Ontario. It's here he works on his sculpture for the next year, and of course does a little seaplane flying and a little fishing. The National Gallery of Canada produced a publication on all of Robert Murray's works. The book is entitled Robert Murray, The Factory as a Studio.